The conspirators were unlucky in the most fatal way. Apparently, they found out only about the fact of the hetman's secret correspondence with the Poles, but they did not have any specifics. The denunciation has been preserved, and according to modern historians, it gave the impression of an unfounded accusation, but without evidential slander. In addition, he sent the polished letters and the drawing of the coat of arms to Peter. On this basis, some historians believe that Mazepa Sego only conducted a kind of radio game with the knowledge of Moscow. However, other explanations are quite acceptable. The hetman did not do this out of spiritual nobility, from the fact that he learned about the machinations of the enemies, and decided to forestall events by presenting himself as white and fluffy. The version is not so fantastic, given the realities of that time. After all, the Poles offered hereditary ownership, and the hetman is an important person, but still elective. As they were elected, they could have been re-elected. It happened more than once, and in this case, the deposed won. Sorry, the re-elected hetman had to get out of the way urgently, if only he could. In this situation, what was left for Mazepa, except that the same perish in Russia? According to some reports, by that time, a black cat had run between the hetman and the almighty Menshikov. Allegedly, even Menshikov was going to displace Mazepa and replace him with his own man. If this is true, if Menshikov it is possible, just put his associates on Kokubi. Secret relations with the Poles are quite logical and understandable. Whatever it was, Mazepa justified himself by informing Moscow in addition. A lot of interesting things about Turkey's military preparations and Leshinsky's relations with the Crimean Khan. The Tsar sent Mazepa another sable fur coat, and Kokubi with a spark gave him to punish. The hetman immediately ordered both their heads to be cut off, and took all their movable and immovable property for himself. Some historians write that he did not take it for himself, but signed it off to the military treasury, but this does not change much. Mazepa had very trusted people sitting on his finances. And just a year later, when the Swedish corps of King Charles joined the hetmanate, Mazepa joined him at the head of a Cossack detachment. Some historians again write that the hetman himself was white and fluffy, and the foreman forced him to take this step, literally at gunpoint. Personally, this version seems doubtful to me. Firstly, the hetman had a strong enough family to cope with the Swedish party, and in addition, it was possible to enlist the support of Moscow. Secondly, there is another version that has the right to exist, that the hetman, who was tired of being chosen, saw for himself, in the ensuing confusion, a good chance to settle down in life even better and calmer. It is quite possible that the fact that the Swedes were walking also played a role. The Swedish army, which had won many victories in the 17th century, was considered almost the strongest in Europe by inertia, and Mazepa could well decide that from now on Russian influence in the hetmanate would be finished. Alas, both newfound allies very quickly realized that they had made a mistake. Karl did not receive the serious replenishment promised by the hetman. Only a bunch of Cossacks arrived with Mazepa. Pessimists estimate their number at 1,500, optimists 5. Even if the second figure is correct, it turns out that only every 10th Cossack followed the hetman to the Swedes. When the Cossacks went to fight with the Russians, they exhibited at least 50,000 sabers. So the hetmanate, for the most part, clearly did not support Mazepa. Colonels and foremen from those who hurriedly followed Mazepa, very quickly, almost every single one, defected to the Russian camp, where they were received with complete cordiality on Peter's secret instructions. There in the Russian camp, the foreman quickly elected a new hetman, Colonel Ivan Skoropadsky. The mercenary regiments had disappeared somewhere. The highest church hierarchies, after consulting, decided to publicly proclaim Mazepa anathemusian speech a curse. It is also excommunication from the church. In the absence of the original, an effigy of Mazepa was hung on the gallows with a large gathering of people. In addition, Peter, with his characteristic black humor, ordered to make a 4-kilogram cast iron medal with the image of the hanged Judas and the Judas pieces of silver lying around. Mazepan was supposed to hang this weighty regalia around his neck as soon as he could be caught. The idea, in general, is not without grace. With the knowledge of Ukrainian historians mythologists, they write in all seriousness that at the same time, Karl Mazepa, concluded a kind of union agreement between two equal powers. Nonsense, of course. What is equality? Why the fright? Charles, though soon defeated at Poltava, remained the legitimate king of not the weakest country in Europe. But Mazepa was now nobody, and there was no way to call him. The Hetmanate did not follow him. Besides, a new hetman, approved by Moscow, was already sitting there. Almost the entire foreman ran over to Peter. Mazepa had only a couple of thousand Cossacks and 3 barrels of money left. He's still an equal ally. That's when, by the way, the native Ukrainian yellow-blue flag was born. It was a purely Swedish idea. It was simply necessary to somehow distinguish their Vlasiv men from the Cossacks who fought on the side of the Russians. The Cossacks did not have any military uniform, so Karl ordered the Mazepans to tie in signs on stakes, that is, pennants of the colors of the Swedish flag, a yellow cross on a blue cloth. Then things went very sad. The Russian corps led by Menshikov stormed the hetman's capital Baturin. Since then, another black legend has been walking among his followers. Allegedly, the Russians ruthlessly slaughtered the entire population of Baturin, from the elderly to small grandfathers. Another nonsense. They burned and looted, of course, a lot, but in those days, everyone did it. A few years ago, the then president of Ukraine Yushchenko was greatly disgraced, ordered large-scale archaeological excavations to be carried out in Baturin, hoping to find huge mass graves, stuffed with hundreds of skeletons of victims of the Menshikov massacre. No matter how they dug, they found only about 3 dozen skulls, among which there was not a single female or child. And besides, Peter's orders have been preserved to allocate some allowance to the Baturinsky victims of the fire. So, the civilian population remained alive. The Cossacks took Mazepa's side, foolishly, because there were more than 300 of them, and the Russian army of many thousands had already entered the Hetmanate. The Sich was very quickly stormed, ravaged, and burned to the ground. Those Cossacks who managed to escape settled in the Crimea, having somehow forgotten about their high mission, the zealots of the Orthodox faith. The Crimean Khan, as a practical man, also did not bother with the difference in faith, but quickly took the Cossacks into service. Professional warriors, a thing in the household, is not superfluous. With grief, Mazepa began sending secret messengers to Peter. Kailsa asked for forgiveness and even offered to capture King Charles and deliver him alive to the Russian camp. It is possible that in the current situation, Mazepa, for the sake of royal forgiveness and restoration of rights, would really have tried to do this, but there was no opportunity. The forces of Mazepa and the Swedes were very much not equal. What followed was simple and uncomplicated. Near Poltava, Russian regiments, together with detachments of the new hetman, who swore allegiance to the goal, combed the Swedes in the tail and in the mane. The remnants of the Swedish army, surrounded by Prince Menshikov's cavalry and Cossacks, surrendered. Karl and Mazepa, accompanied by literally a handful of soldiers and Cossacks, still escaped and fled to Bender, the capital of the Turkish Pasha there. But, even there, Mazepa, according to a famous poem, only dreamed of peace. Karl most unceremoniously borrowed the same 3 barrels of money and distributed it to his Swedes, leaving Mazepa without a penny. Peter, burning with a desire to hang the mentioned medal around the hetman's neck, offered the Pasha 300,000 chervonets for the issuance of Mazepa. Pasha initially refused, but who knows how events could have unfolded further. Mazepa was well aware of the venality of the Sultan's nobility, and had every reason to suspect that in the end they might give him away, and soon, the harassed one, who had fallen into utter insignificance, gave his soul to God. Some of the current independent historiographers have refined this story beyond recognition. In all seriousness, it is claimed that Mazepa concluded an equal alliance of 2 independent powers with Charles. That's just no written evidence of this has been preserved, and contemporaries of the events about the union are amicably silent. The haberdasher and the cardinal are a force. Nevertheless, it is loudly proclaimed that Mazepa intended to create an independent Ukrainian statehood out of the noblest motives. Actually, I was going to, who would argue. However, given everything that is known about Mazepa, let's say with confidence. This character did not bother with any such noble ideals at all, but thought exclusively about his own benefit. If he really happened to become the ruler of an independent Ukraine, it would be a 100% feudal possession, where a handful of nobles would reign supreme over the enslaved black people, and Mazepa would rise above all this, using every opportunity to stuff the bins with gold. The fact that President Yushchenko established an order called the Cross of Mazepa is not at all surprising. It is much more surprising that in Russia, in the old and prestigious series The Lives of Wonderful People, a biography of Mazepa was published, written by a Russian author, but written straight from the standpoint of ardent independent artists. Well, maybe she will also be awarded the Cross of Mazepa for work and honor. Despite the fact that Mazepa, to use the words of Arkady Gaidar, is a character infamously famous, there is no denying that he was a bright personality. The same cannot be said about all of his successors. The Hetmanate was slowly failing. Skoropadsky, judging by what is known about him, and much is known, was a grey figure devoid of any determination. In extreme cases, he was only enough to submissively, tearfully ask for some liberties to be returned, to which Petersburg did not agree in any way, and the hetman obediently fell silent. The territory of the Hetmanate at that time was limited, as in the old days, to the present Poltava and Chernihiv regions, and Kiev with its surroundings. Yes, the mansions are not royal. Petersburg began to slowly but methodically curtail the former Cossack liberties. There was no specific Muscovite villainy in this. The usual process of creating a centralized state was underway. Similarly in England, the former liberties of Scotland and Wales, once independent states, were methodically curtailed, and in France, since the time of Cardinal Richelieu, they have diligently brought their own people like Burgundy, Lorraine and Languedoc to one denominator, turning them into ordinary provinces of the kingdom. Cynically speaking, the dog's tail was chopped down just in parts. In 1709th year, the hetman was assigned to supervise a Russian resident, and a year later, another one. Officially, they were instructed to maintain the order of improvement, together with the hetman, and secret instructions were prescribed to monitor the hetman and the foreman, and, if anything, suppress any possible mutiny by Russian troops. By that time, by order of Peter, the hetman's capital was moved to Glukov, on the border with Great Russia, and 2 Russian regiments were garrisoned there. A little later, St. Petersburg began to appoint and remove colonels and general officers, often putting Russian officials in their place. In 1722nd year, another reform, in fact, took away power from the hetman and the foreman. Under the hetman, a little Russian collegium was established, consisting of 6 staff officers of those 2 regiments, chaired by the brigadier of the then military rank, intermediate between Colonel and General Vilyaminov. It was ordered to accept complaints against all judicial and administrative institutions of the Hetmanate, collect and spend taxes and duties, make sure that there was no oppression of Cossacks and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the foreman, and control all the paperwork of the military office. Professor Hrushevsky wrote later that this situation turned the Ukrainian autonomy into a ghost devoid of content, which he was not at all mistaken about. It is quite possible that Hrushevsky was also right when he wrote that Skoropadsky's quick death was due to chagrin. After that, the hetmanate existed for several years without a hetman at all. Peter issued a decree in 1723 year, which stated that the government was concerned about finding a reliable person for the hetman's post due to the fact that almost all hetmans, except for the first Khmelnytsky and the last Skoropadsky, turned out to be traitors to the oath, and since the current paperwork is generally secured, one should not bother the Tsar with requests for the election of a hetman. The time will come, Petersburg will be engaged. This went on for 4 years, until finally, in 1727th year, they allowed to choose a new hetman, Mirgorod Colonel Danil Apostol, who turned out to be, let's just say, also a rather colorless person, who did not show himself in any special way. Liberties were not added. The little Russian collegium, however, was abolished, having found a lot of abuses behind it. But instead of it, the General Court was established by 6 people, equally from the Hetmanate and from St. Petersburg. The position of the resident was retained, and the hetman was obliged to confer with him in all managerial matters. And in the military, he was subordinate to the field marshal of the Russian troops. The Zaporozhye Sich no longer obeyed the Hetmanate. Over time, the Cossacks in the Crimea apparently got bored, and they asked back to Russia. At the beginning of 1734th year, they were allowed to found a new Sich in a new place, but they were subordinated to the commander of the Russian troops in Ukraine. In 1734th year, the apostle died. By that time, the Hetmanate began to lose its former military significance. One typical example. During the Russian-Turkish War of 1735–1739 years, she had to put up a 16,000th Cossack corps. However, more than 3,000 conscripts deserted without reaching the theater of operations, and half of the remaining showed up without horses, on foot, about which the head of the Russian troops, the famous Field Marshal Minich, expressed himself in his hearts, as mice only eat bread for nothing. After the death of the apostle, the Hetmanate was ruled directly by St. Petersburg for 26 years. Through the head of the restored Little Russian Collegium, always a great Russian, with the broadest powers. The Hetmanate was restored only by the Empress Elizabeth in 1750th year. However, the matter was not allowed to take its course. The hetman, calling things by their proper names, simply appointed a man 100% his own, Kirill Razumovsky, the younger brother of the husband of Empress Elizabeth, Alexei Razumovsky, a secret, but according to all the rules, married to her. This was already a purely decorative figure. The future hetman left Ukraine at an early age to study at one of the European universities. Before his appointment, he led the life of a St. Petersburg aristocrat, married a relative of the Empress Ekaterina Naryshkina, and after becoming a hetman, he practically did not live in Ukraine. He was simply bored there. He preferred to shine in St. Petersburg, in parallel with the hetmanate. He became the commander of the Izmailovsky Guards regiment, which, from the point of view of the then high society, looked perhaps even more prestigious than the semi-operatic hetmanate. Razumovsky's only contribution to the state ideology of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps, was that he put the Cossacks in a single uniform, blue kaftans with red collars. He did not carry out any more significant reforms. The hetmanate, not at all saddened by the absence of a hetman, was ruled by a foreman. Under the slightly weakened influence of Razumovsky at the Court of Control of St. Petersburg. In 1762nd year, Razumovsky, as commander of the Izmailovsky regiment, took an active part in the overthrow of Peter III and the enthronement of Catherine, which, of course, allowed him to maintain his position at court, but only as a colonel of the guards. Catherine, having barely ascended to the throne, decided to end the hetmanate, and not only with him. Outlining her state-building program in a letter to the chief prosecutor, she expressed an adamant desire to bring Ukraine, Livonia and Finland to Russification. True, it was not about Russification, but solely about eliminating local laws and regulations that did not correspond to the general imperial ones that existed in all 3 regions. The creative legacy of Cardinal Richelieu and nothing more. She spoke about the hetmanate quite unequivocally. So that the century and the name of the hetmans disappeared, but Tokmo would be the person who was made into a worthy dignity. Catherine owed a lot to Razumovsky, as one of the active participants in her accession. But the state interests were higher. Everything happened very culturally. The famous Grigory Orlov came to visit Razumovsky. At that time, 1764th year, was still the almighty favorite and lover of Catherine, the father of her son, who later became Count Babrinsky. Unlike his brother Alexei, who often showed himself to be an intelligent and subtle diplomat, Grishka remained, let's say, not particularly burdened with intelligence, which was recognized by everyone, including the Empress, and therefore, without much diplomacy, the unpretentious explained, simply, they say, there is such a thing here, Kiryusha. My mother decided to annul the hetmanate forever, and therefore resigned to milder in a good way, or else for good. You will be forcibly removed and you will fall into disgrace on charges of anti-state intentions. So think Sokolik, quickly. Despite all his narrow-mindedness, Grigory Orlov was an extremely serious and influential person, and it was about the direct command of Catherine. Razumovsky, first of all a courtier, did not hesitate for a long time and immediately applied for dismissal from such a difficult and dangerous position. Just as immediately, Catherine's petition was granted. For his compliance, Razumovsky received an annual lifetime pension of 60,000 rubles and huge land holdings in Ukraine, including an entire parish, and of course, he stayed at court. In place of the Hetmanate, the usual provinces were formed Chernihiv and Poltava. Catherine dealt with the Zaporozhye Sich even more unceremoniously. On the 5th of June, 1775, General Tekeli surrounded the Sich with large military forces and announced to the Zaporozhye that their Cossacks were being abolished. Part of the Cossacks, who surrendered unconditionally in the face of many times superior forces, went to Turkey. The part that agreed to continue serving directly in the Russian army was resettled to the Kuban, where it formed the Black Sea. Later, the Cuban Cossack army. Over time, many Cossacks who went abroad returned there, having pushed around Turkey and Austria. In general, both the Hetmanate and the Zaporozhye Sich surrendered almost without resistance. True, in 1791 year in Berlin, the then capital of Prussia, the little Russian nobleman Vasily Kapnist appeared, received an audience with Minister Herzberg, and began to ask openly whether Prussia would support him if the Cossacks, dissatisfied with the loss of liberties and privileges, rose to revolt against the Petersburg tyranny. Prussia was not going to participate in such games. Herzberg made it clear that he did not intend to conduct any further negotiations. Kapnist returned to Russia with nothing, spat on all rebellious ideas, and later became a famous writer. All the failed rebellions were doomed to failure in advance, precisely because the Hetmanate nobility thought not about riots, but about becoming a full-fledged nobility of the empire. The founding fathers of the self-defense theorists like to write that liberty and freedom for everyone allegedly flourished in Ukraine before Catherine. But Catherine the damned German, she fixed all the free ones. This does not correspond to the historical truth at all. Serfdom in Ukraine has been formed for decades by the efforts of the foreman himself. Little by little, she took over the premature lands, and as the hero of the famous Strugatsky novel put it, what is the associate of the land without serfs? Khmelnytsky also announced with his universals that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that is, personally free peasants and urban burghers, are obliged to perform obedience, that is, duties in relation to both the top of the elders and the church. As in Russia, the higher Little Russian clergy owned vast lands. The foreman, looking at his Russian and Polish brothers in the class, wanted to become the same absolute masters over the slaves. Immediately after the Pereyaslav Rada, she began to beg from the Russian Tsars chartered letters for the estate, which would allow turning the acquired into hereditary possessions. Hetman Vygovsky turned out to be the most resourceful, who managed to get letters for the same estates from both the King of Poland and the Tsar of Moscow. Whoever wins, the hetman wins. There are a lot of documents that testify to the true state of affairs, and how Moscow, and later St. Petersburg, tried to pull the nascent landowners. A report to Moscow from the Tsarist official Protasiev, who was with the hetman. In Little Russia, the latest officials get their wealth from taxes, robbery, and wine trade. If the hetman determines which one is a centurion, even of the poorest of his servants, in 1 or 2 years, he will have a yard, tires, mills, and all sorts of flocks and household belongings. It is not difficult to guess that a considerable number of workers were required to maintain all this grace, and land and livestock, and it is extremely desirable for the unwitting, who understand too much about themselves, and the most disenfranchised, best of all serfs. It's ridiculous to think that the hetman aristocracy. And little by little, it turned out that the aristocracy saw in a fellow countryman peasant, a brother Ukrainian. In no other country in the world has such good nonsense been noticed for the aristocracy. On the contrary, everywhere the nobles, no matter how they were called, with great eagerness and great zeal, sought to turn their blood-related co-religionists into disenfranchised working cattle. Peter's instructions to his representatives under the hetman have been preserved. Strictly look after the colonels, so that they do not burden the people with bribes and various taxes. To hinder the general foreman and colonels from the hetman's council, to exhaust the work of the Cossacks and their people. However, as often happens, these orders remained unfulfilled. God is high, the king is far away. At one time, Mazepa, who had done a lot to enslave the common people, introduced the honorary title of Bunchik Comrade, and later a badge comrade. The holders of such a title received neither posts nor salaries. But the trick is that this title was massively received by foremen and their descendants, the owners of estates, thereby turning into a kind of estate like the nobility. At the same time, the foremen tried in every way to prevent the transition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the Cossacks. Moreover, the masses transferred Cossacks to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who no longer had any rights except duties. Of course, not the Poles, but the Little Russians, who received the nobility in the most legitimate way from the Polish kings. The process went on for more than 200 years before Catherine. So Catherine simply legally legalized the historically established state of affairs by decree. In 1781 year, with a letter of commendation, she turned the foremen, her descendants, as well as Bunchukov and badge comrades, into hereditary nobles of the Russian Empire. They were equalized in rights with other Russian nobles, and their families are recorded in the genealogical book of Chernihiv and Poltava provinces. Accordingly, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were converted into their serfs. If someone decides that the newly baked nobility protested against such innovations and reacted with indignation to the enslavement of the free Ukrainian people, she was cruelly mistaken. On the contrary, there was general rejoicing among the noble nobility. Their rights have finally been legitimized in the most indisputable way. Now they could own serfs quite legally. What happened next bears a clear imprint of comedy. The process of formation of the new nobility was accompanied by a lot of fraud with forgery of documents. Noble origin, as elsewhere in Europe, had to be confirmed with documents, and this was bad, because the foremen who became the owners of estates and peasants had the darkest and foggiest origin. In 1654 year in Pereyaslavl, only 300 real nobles were sworn to the Moscow Tsar, who were able to submit impeccable documents if necessary. However, when a commission on the analysis of noble rights was created in Little Russia, after the letter of merit, 100,000 nobles ran into it. Moreover, each of them had a bunch of ancient-looking letters, drawings of coats of arms, sprawling family trees, from which it followed that other applicants descend almost from Adam and Eve. Again, this cannot be considered purely Russian specifics. On the contrary, in this case, Russia was lagging behind Europe, where such amusements have been in use for a long time. Perhaps the most striking example, the famous captain of the Royal Musketeers, de Treville, whom many should remember from the novels of Dumont. At one time, in the town of Troisville in Gascony, there lived and chewed a young man named Troisville, who came from a solid, rich, respected family in those places, but here's the trouble, who had no noble dignity. But the Gascons, the people are smart. The young man, like many, decided to go to the capital and make a career. A young man named Troisville left Troisville, but de Treville had already arrived in Paris, with a pile of extremely convincing documents confirming his nobility, dating back almost to the Crusaders.